Hello, and welcome to the ADE Spotlight podcast. My name is Jim Haggerty. As a provider of substance abuse assessments and client management databases, we have the privilege to work with terrific partners across the United States and Canada. In this series, we plan to talk to some of our colleagues about their work in the field of substance abuse assessment, prevention, and treatment. By sharing knowledge and experiences, it is my hope that we can all learn from each other. What we have learned, what the challenges are now and in the future, and how the ever-evolving technology impacts our work. ADE remains committed to working with our partners and using our experience with both substance use assessment and technology to provide the tools our colleagues rely on. As we learn from each other, we improve the value of our services. My guest today is Bryan Ellis. Bryan is the founder and CEO of ADE Incorporated. Bryan, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. And in the interest of full disclosure, I just want to say Bryan has been a terrific mentor and a good friend to me and the rest of us here at ADE. So we look forward to this conversation. I want to talk, Bryan, about the assessment instruments we have. But prior to, I'd like you to go back even further, talk a little bit about what you were doing prior to ADE and how that work formed this idea that you would create a computer automated substance abuse assessment.
Well, I guess I was working in an inpatient hospital treatment program for substance abuse individuals, and had been working there for several years and doing assessments, and I got in a position where I could begin doing some research, and I had a doctoral student come in from Wayne State University. He was a doctoral student in psychology, and together we started to look at the impact of alcohol and substance abuse on the physiology and the psychology of these patients. And he was using several different tests, and we were trying to evaluate whether or not there were any changes over time from being abstinent in the performance on these instruments. And one of the instruments we used was the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And this was in the late 70s, and they, meaning the people that were marketing the MMPI, were just starting to utilize computer scoring. And it was really that exposure that kind of planted the seed for the possibility of utilizing computers in the substance abuse assessment and treatment procedures. And at the time, I think the MMPI, in fact, I'm sure they were using a mainframe. And so I thought, well, maybe we could utilize a mainframe, which we had access to in the hospital. And I put together a psychosocial survey, and the goal was to utilize that computer capability to help standardize our procedures for gathering psychosocial information on our patients. Unfortunately, the survey was quite large and cumbersome, and access to the computer was more difficult than we thought, and it never really got off the ground. But it really did begin my thinking regarding developing a substance abuse assessment instrument that was going to be computer scored.
Were you aware of anybody else doing that kind of thing?
No, I have to say I was not. I'm not saying there weren't. In the substance abuse field, I don't think there were. There might have been, but I wasn't aware of it. I think we were the first one to do it.
And when you say we, who was on your development team? Who was instrumental in putting this together?
Well, it was really me. There wasn't anyone else. This person that I had helping me in the research, he went back to school and he was not involved. And it was really my interest in pursuing this and not anyone else's. It wasn't, once I had decided that I was going to try to do it, I really spent about a year and a half reading everything I could read on doing assessment instruments and validation of questions and the pitfalls of doing surveys of this type. And it was only after that amount of time and developing various surveys and talking to clinical people as far as what kinds of questions do they ask and all those kinds of things, that I was able to put together the survey. And then I wrote the algorithm for the questions and how they should be scored and what relevance the answer to a particular question and patterns of questions, how relevant they were. And it was really the pattern of questions that I was most interested in. Just like in a personal interview, you're interested in the pattern of responses, not necessarily a single response, although they could have more bearing than others. And based on that, my brother at the time was a professor, associate professor at a local university. He was teaching statistics and computer programming, and utilized his skills and access to his students in his classes for testing out the survey. And he had a Apple Macintosh computer at home, one that you put discs in. I can't remember. I think it was a 5-chan or something of that type nature. And that's how we initially put it together. And then once we did the programming, and then we tested it out with his students to make sure the program was working and felt comfortable with that, we used his students again to develop like a sample, benchmark sample for the data and the reporting. Then from there, I contacted various people in the community that I knew that ran clinical programs and had them use the instrument with their patients and compare it to the personal interviews that their staffs conducted on these people so that we could begin to determine how valid it was. And the personal interview was the primary validation criteria that I...
That's fascinating. Now, this was prior to the widespread use of computers. So how was this, when you went to these local programs and introduced this idea, how was this received by your peers?
Well, I think they were being nice to me. I don't think they felt like this was something that was going to be all that valuable to them. The personal interview was the Rosetta Stone, so to speak, and so it was the idea that a machine could do the same thing as a personal interview was long way from being accepted at that time. So that was a huge obstacle, overcoming that. But more important, equally important, was providing access to computers. How are we going to be able to have people use this instrument without PCs being available? And so I was able to contact a company called National ADE Incorporated. They were in Atlanta. That's where their main offices were. They had 2 mainframes, one in New Jersey and one in Denver. And they, at the time, were the company that did all these infomercials late at night, and you'd call in and order these things, and they had these mainframes that would take this data down and then send out the products that were ordered. So they had that capability. It was just a matter of tapping into it. And what I did is we had these dumb terminals. They were like little modems that you put like headphones down in them. You dial the number of the mainframe, you put the headphone, this little device, down into the modem, and it would connect to the mainframe, and then they would have to key the information in, and that's how they got the report. It was very cumbersome and actually quite expensive. So in order to make this more user-friendly, I had someone take my program and put it on an Atari cartridge. At the time, the Atari computer was used for games, and they were relatively inexpensive, so I was able to get some Atari computers, have these cartridges made up, and I got a hold of an Epson printer, the cheapest dot matrix you could find, and had it wired to the Atari computer. So we had basically a PC and a printer, and that's kind of how we got going with it. And then PCs became more popular and available, and so the computing capability issue was starting to be resolved. It was then trying to get counselors and assessors to accept the idea of a computer assessment. And the force that really brought this about was the fact that at the time, the country was really starting to focus on DUI offenders. The Reagan administration was tying their state highway funds to doing assessments and treatment of DUI offenders, and since the courts now were mandated to do assessments, the instrument became a vehicle for them to meet these requirements. And the courts basically said this is what we're going to do. Not that they stood on the instrument alone, but they required their counselors and the programs that were doing assessments for them to utilize the instrument. So it made it much more efficient for them to meet their goals. And many of them were very high volume courts, so they needed something that would help expedite the process.
And this was a single assessment instrument, or did you have multiple variations of assessment instruments?
It was a single instrument, and it was really, as maybe I mentioned earlier, it was really based on format and the procedures that clinical interviewers would utilize in doing assessments. We weren't trying to do anything different. What we were trying to do was to standardize the process of administration. The questions were asked the same way every single time. And it was scored exactly the same way every time. The computer never had a bad day. It didn't care what the person filling out the survey looked like. So it was a very objective, standardized way of gathering and evaluating information. The only variation was the issue of the Spanish version, because we were starting to get interest from states where there were larger Spanish populations. So I took the survey to translators in the court and clinical programs where they had translators for Spanish-speaking population, and had them translate the survey. We used people in Michigan, Georgia, Texas, New Mexico, and once they had done a translation, then we took all of their translations and had a translator kind of combine them, and then we took the survey out to clinics where they had large Hispanic population and Spanish-speaking counselors, and had them utilize the instrument to make sure that the results from the Spanish translation was the same as what would be from a non-Spanish translation. So that was really the only variation in the instrument.
We're talking about the substance abuse and life circumstance evaluation. At what point did you then expand on that and take that instrument and develop the needs assessment?
Well, kind of going back to when I was working in the hospital-based program, I really felt that to do a good evaluation of a person, you really need as much information about them as possible. And so I felt like we had to kind of go towards the psychosocial, gather information regarding emotional stability, employment status, marital status, attitude issues, in addition to the substance abuse. So that really was what motivated me to expand the SALSI to the needs, so that we had a better profile of that individual. I think it's worked out very, very well.
What challenges did you find when you turned your eyes toward the juvenile population to develop the JASI?
Well, I had experience in doing assessments on adolescents, and there are some unique aspects to them, obviously, compared to adults. But the same kinds of questions were significant as far as identifying abuse and dependence and withdrawal and those kinds of issues. But again, I followed pretty much the same steps. I talked to counselors. We developed questions that were probably more relevant to an adolescent, trying to get them so they could identify with the questions, which we were able to do, and then took the survey to counselors that were doing adolescent assessments and had them do the comparisons and to find out were we generating the kinds of results that was helpful to the clinician and accurate. And then I was fortunate enough to begin working with a professor at East Carolina University that his graduate students were doing a lot of research with the adolescent school populations in that area, and so they took the JASI and they did their own independent research, not only with substance abusing adolescents, but with the general adolescent population, and compared it to various other instruments that they were using for other kinds of psychological issues. So we really were very lucky to have that opportunity to get their cooperation and assistance in evaluating the JASI.
Now, you have these instruments, the Celsi and the Needs and the Jazzy, and you've had organizations that have been helpful to you in terms of validating them and proving that they're reliable instruments. At what point, as you took this out to local programs or county-wide programs or even statewide programs, at what point was there, say, a tipping point where you felt like this idea was becoming more widely accepted?
Oh, that's a good question. Because we were dealing with two unique aspects. One of them was the computer capability, and two, it was the acceptance on the part of clinicians. I would say probably North Carolina was really the first big client that we had, not the state itself, but they had the DUI education programs throughout the state that the state required that DUI offenders be assessed, and there was an individual there that heard about our instrument. At the time it was the Celsi. He contacted me. His name was Carlton Jacobs, and he really was able to get many of the programs in North Carolina to take a look at the instrument and get the state to accept it as an instrument that they would recognize. And I would say probably that was the big one. We were getting more and more courts in Michigan too, but I think that was the first one out of state that really established us in the field. And then Georgia became the next one, and what drove that was there was a very severe accident in Atlanta. A DUI drunk driver killed a family, and the governor's wife became the head of a committee to evaluate DUI offenders and how to address that population. And it was really that issue that got Georgia to take a look at our instrument, and they adopted it statewide. And we've been there. That was in the late 80s and early 90s, and we've been there ever since. And I think that's a critical point, is the fact that we've been around since 1983. I don't know how many millions of assessments have been done and evaluated by clinicians all over the country, and even out of the country. And if the instrument was not valid, if it wasn't working and helping people make good decisions, we wouldn't be having this conversation. In many ways, I think the instrument is validated every single time it's used.
You mentioned the 30 plus years of experience here, and over that time the technology has certainly continued to evolve from PCs being very popular to moving on past PCs into more mobile platforms such as tablets, mobile phones, and the like. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how that has impacted ADE and how it's impacted the development of the various assessment instruments.
Well, I think even from the beginning, there was a need to streamline the data input and reporting capabilities, particularly with large volume programs. Courts, for example, I mentioned 36th District Court. They had large volume. Metro Court in Albuquerque, the same way. Houston, Texas, they had large volumes. It was too cumbersome to have to key in every single survey. So the first step was to use optic scanners. So that was the saving grace for these larger programs, that they could scan in the data and get their reports without utilizing a lot of staff time and energy. But as the technology evolved, as you know, we went to taking the survey on the computer screen, storing information. The technology has really affected the way the surveys are taken, the way they're scored, the way the data is evaluated and reported. I mean, it's really been the primary factor in this whole process. And it's not just true with our instrument, it's true, in general with all business and hospital. I mean, it's just computers have changed the game. So, yeah, technology technology has been the big factor, and I think it's still influencing how the surveys are administered and scored, and how people can access them. And I'm not sure we can see the end of the influence of technology on this process.
What do you see as the challenges going forward from here for ADE?
That's a good question. I think there's certainly a need for assessing. I don't think that's going to stop. But I think that because of technology, really, the ability to set up client records and to pull together information about individuals in order to determine what is the best way of addressing their issues and how do we monitor it to make sure that they're doing it. I think developing the case records, which we have done, and the database development and reporting capabilities that we've done is really a significant step towards really providing the best assessment, intervention, and treatment for these individuals. I think the other area that is coming, since I live out here in Colorado, I have firsthand information on experience with the passing of the recreational marijuana laws. I think that more and more states are going to go that way, and I think the issue that they're going to have to deal with is trying to evaluate individuals who are using marijuana, particularly in DUI cases, and how do they measure it and how do they assess it. And I think our instruments are geared to do that evaluation, but I think that there's probably some refinement that will need to be done, and then it will be a matter of presenting that capability to the courts again as a tool for helping them do the job they need to do as far as assessment and determining intervention. So I think both of those things. I think the ability to gather information, to store it, to report it, to track it on individuals, and with this marijuana issue, which I think is really going to become more and more of an issue based on what I can see out here, it's going to be big business, just like the alcohol and liquor industry is. So.
I'm sure you're right about that, and I look forward to these challenges, Bryan, and I just I want to thank you for spending some time with us and for really your friendship and support over the years. And
well, this is the Mutual Admiration Society. I really appreciate your allowing me to be out here and enjoy the sunshine, which we didn't have a whole lot of in Michigan when I lived there for 65 years. But I feel very confident that I've got someone like you there to help me out, and I appreciate the fact that you let me think I'm still important in this process. So thank you.
Okay, Bryan, we'll do this again soon. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of the ADE Spotlight Podcast. I hope you found it insightful. If you have any comments, suggestions for future topics, or would like to be featured in an upcoming episode, please let us know. You may reach us by email at support@adeincorp.com.